Let's talk a little bit about how to actually communicate naturally with deer. How are deer communicating with each other? And the first thing I want to cover is frequency, okay? Everybody asks, well, you do these demonstrations, you do them in real time, and you're not really doing it in real time, I guess is what I'm getting at. You're demonstrating them and you're doing them over and over, and you're showing it in kind of a short, condensed time period. But when it comes to actual frequency of calling, deer, they're vocal, but they're not doing a large volume of vocalization in any short period of time. So what you want to keep in your mind is patience, okay? So let's just give a scenario of how often would I doe bleed, okay? If I'm going to doe bleed and I have live deer nearby me, or I know deer are close by and I want them to come out, I may doe bleed. I might do a doe bleed once, and I'll wait 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 seconds, do another one, and then I'll just hold off. I could hold off up to 15, 20 minutes. So it'd be something, similar to, I'm gonna wait 10, 15 seconds, possibly. And then I'll do another one. Okay, now I did something maybe a little bit more emotional after that break, saying it's the same pitch deer, that's the same deer, okay? Now, if I was going to do something a little bit quicker in frequency, I might change the tone of the doe, that it's an older doe. Now that doesn't sound like the same doe, okay? So now I got 2 does. So that's kind of the frequency thought. You could be another doe a little bit shorter time apart, but if you're going to be the same doe, you definitely want to make sure that you space this out. And now they don't just keep doing this time after time after time after time. This is something that they're just going to do. I would spread it out 15, 20 minutes. I wouldn't be afraid to do a half hour, 45 minutes. It depends on how spooky your deer are, okay? And it depends on the time of the day as well. So keep that in mind when it comes to frequency, okay? Now, the frequency can change, okay? And so now let's talk a little bit about that. And frequency in the scenario of if I have a deer in real eyesight and I want to try and call that deer into me, what I don't want to do is have too much frequency, keep going back and forth, because deer just don't go back and forth. Boom, 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 boom. You said something, I said something. They don't have conversations like that. So you want to kind of break it up a little bit. And you never want to, a good scenario is to never call out a deer if it's looking at you, okay? That's something, it's kind of a rule that I have, is I never call out a deer that's looking at me. One is they can pinpoint me. Second is they're already thinking about what's happening in the scenario and it's on their brain. I would prefer them to look away or do something different or give me a sign of I don't really care about you. And then I would call again at them, but I'd never call at them. As you get back, that'd be a directional situation. But if a deer's looking at you and you call at it, there's too many ways that you can freak them out or make a mistake by being too loud because too much adrenaline, or say the wrong thing while they're thinking about you, and it can work against you a lot of times. So just keep that in mind. Now, another thing I want to talk about is community calling, okay? When it comes to community calling, you want to think about the scenarios and the situations that are happening that particular time of the year, or something that you would want to create that'd be naturally happening at that particular time when you're hunting. Now, community calling could be a number of things. One is it could be does interacting with each other, and you're doing it because you want to bring them out into the field. So that'd be a doe saying something to another doe, an older doe saying, okay, I'm the boss out here, and then maybe a fawn bleats in there, okay? And that would be an early season more type of a scenario. Now, if it's pre-rut and the bucks are starting to stake out their territory, and all of a sudden you start sounding like the natural does are hanging with the fawns still, they're kind of interacting like we talked about, and then a little buck comes in, he starts kind of dogging the does, and they don't really know what's going on. They're the first ones you see start running around. They're really a hassle to the does. They don't like it. They hate being chased and bugged by them. But maybe all of a sudden, if it's a little later in that season, you start doing that, okay? Now you're a buck coming in there, a young buck, who's just grunting a little bit more often, frequency-wise. He's being antagonistic, and that scenario could drive a buck who staked out that territory within earshot of flying in there and just being upset because there's another buck in there, causing trouble in an area that he owns. So that's kind of the different things that you can think about when it comes to community calling. One more is like when they're actually in the breeding process, the scenario about a buck actually interacting with the doe. He could be frustrated. She could be ready, saying it's time to go. Those are things that you would have as a group or a community that would be happening around the rut time. Bucks will actually be rattling at that time. And when it comes to rattling, we'll get into that a little bit later, but early season rattling, pre-rut, and rut rattling are completely different. So, and does, by the way, come into rattling as well. So keep that in mind. Those are ways that you can communicate. Those are some tips on frequency. Those are some tips on community calling. Now let's talk a little bit about seasonal calling, okay? When it comes to seasonal calling, I'm thinking the way the deer are thinking, okay? Early season, calling in a buck, talking like another buck, is not a lot happening there, okay? You're not really able to challenge the deer. It's early season. They're not too worked up. It can be hot out. It can be water. It can be lots of things happening that they're just doing different things. They're starting to break up, but they're still tolerant, and they're still even hanging around together. And so, trying to create a fight doesn't really make a whole lot of sense early season. Early season, I'm thinking about calling the does, okay? I like to take my does early. So then I'm using my fawn bleats. I'm trying to create scenarios where the does come in. Maybe I'm trying to pattern a buck. I know he'll hang into the timber, and I'll try and call the does out to me early in the early season on the edges or into the food sources, and maybe that buck will come out and come a little early, and I'll get a shot at him. Or maybe it's a water hole, and I'm saying, all right, community of does and fawns at the water hole, it's safe to come down and take a drink. If you're in the timber water hole, you might come right into there. So that's kind of an early season scenario. If I'm rattling, very light tickle stuff. They're still trying to figure out their racks, doing some things like that. They're not getting aggressive. So that would be an early season progression for me. If I'm going to speak from one buck to another buck, it's just going to be short contact type grunts, So those are some things that I'm going to do toward my early season. Now, as things progress, you can be a little bit more emotional. You start getting into the pre-rut, not quite really pre-rut where they're trying to rip each other's head off, but you can start getting a little more aggressive with some of these rattling tactics and a little more aggressive with some of the grunts, and maybe they're sparring and all of a sudden one of them ticked off the other one, and you throw in a little bit of a growl in there or something like that, or you do some buck grunts after some, light rattling or some things like that. The does, about that time, they're really not quite ready, but they're starting to get curious, because now you got to remember, a doe is trying to pick out the good looking guy. She wants to mate with the right genetics. So she has to be attracted to that buck as well. So they tend to get a little bit more curious about light rattling, some buck grunts. Maybe you throw another doe in there and she's like, hey, I'm the boss, doe, what, and that might bring that doe in as well. So that's when you start getting right around that time into the pre-rut there. Now, as you get in deeper into that and they start getting more aggressive, I'll start to change my calling tactics. There is a window for rattling that if you don't have a set of black racks in your pack or in your hands, you are just really not taking advantage of something that's extremely successful. I mean, I've rattled in 10 bucks in one sitting during that window before. You can rattle in a lot of deer, okay? So just keep that in mind. When they start getting in that aggressive mode, then you start challenging the different bucks, okay? That's some things that you can do. You can start becoming a doe in estrus. She's the first one to come in. You can start being a doe that's being, a little bit upset with the other doe. She's antagonizing the other doe. Some things like that are starting to happen. The fawns are getting kicked away. The does are kicking the fawns away, especially the button bucks. They're running around. And so now the fawns are running around all emotional, kind of freaked out, and they're all stressed out, and some fawn balls and some things like that can be some scenarios that you can use as you're getting into that time of the year. And now you're being really aggressive, okay? And as you get into this time period, actually into the actual rut and breeding time, now there's just scenarios that you can pick out, and you can do lots of different communication scenarios. And it could be anything from a contact grunt to a cruising buck to see if he wants to be aggressive with you. And if he doesn't, you change it to a doe bleed immediately in a split second, and boom, stop him on a dime and walk him right underneath your stand. So there's lots of different things happening as the season changes. As they actually start the breeding process and the lockdown process, it can be extremely tough, okay? You're gonna get a lot of subordinate bucks that are gonna be much easier to call in, but your bigger, dominant, mature buck with your older does who come into estrus tend to come in first, they'll lock down these big bucks, and they'll just stick with them, and then you don't see deer moving at all. So in a scenario like that, where they're just kind of moseying around during the daylight, and you see your buck is locked on that doe, and you're like, oh, now what do I do? Well, maybe you do a fawn bleat that's freaked out, or a ball that's more aggressive, where she's still got a little parental instincts in her, or maybe you try and upset her thinking you're a doe in estrus and you're trying to take that buck away from her. But if you could draw her in, I promise you, that buck is going to be right on her tail. So that's a great thing to think about during lockdown. A buck most likely isn't going to just come flying in just because you're being another buck or you're being an aggressive buck, but you never know. You can try it. Try not to overdo it. Maybe some rattling, that might throw them off, but typically when they're locked down and they're mature, they understand it's going to be tough to call them in on that. And remember, you can't call in every deer. It doesn't work 100% of the time, all right? Some of my greatest success ratios are calling in that doe early season at 60%. Is about the highest ratio that I've ever called deer in consistently. So if you think you're going to call every deer in, you're not. But learning how to converse with them, learning different ways that they behave, and learning that communication in the different seasons and how to call to them, that's how you become a great hunter. That's how you become a successful hunter, and that's how you learn. And you're not going to learn unless you make a mistake either. You will make mistakes. You're going to do the wrong thing and then go, oh, that didn't work. No, guess what? You're going to be better the next time. When it comes to late season, I don't do a lot of calling at all in late season, to be honest with you. If I do some late season hunting, it's more about patterning the deer in the food source, or potentially there's a little window late season before it gets super cold, where they will start looking for other does that may have not been bred, and they'll come into a second cycle. So some doe estrus bleats during that window. It's not a big window, but it's a window. That could be affected. Some light rattling. They're probably not going to try and tear each other's head off at that time because most of the breeding's done. Those are some things you can do, but really just sound like a deer that would naturally be making vocalizations in their everyday routine or whatever. Your fawns are still a little bit freaked out because they're starting to come back in with their moms after they've been bred, so they're still kind of in that lost mode. And then she'll start kicking away the button bucks because they don't want that genetic of buck to be in there breeding with the same genes, so they'll kick that male away. So maybe some emotional fawn stuff in late season, but overall not a whole lot of calling. So that's a little bit about seasonal. So those are some things that you can think about when it comes to calling, and how to be more effective and how to be more real with your calling and communication.